From FingerLakes1.com, you're listening to Inside the FLX. I'm Josh Durso, and our show today starts in rural Pennsylvania. That's where it all began for Ian Golden, a Tompkins County resident who launched his campaign for NY23 in April of 2017. He's called Tompkins County home for 18 years, started multiple small businesses, and now he is a candidate for Congress. Ian, thanks a lot for being here today.
Josh, yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the opportunity.
So talk to us a little bit about how you got your start in this field of wanting to get involved with politics.
Yeah, I think I was probably, along with a lot of Americans, just, I think, at wit's end with the state of politics. Federal level, all the way down to, I think, just the divisiveness that was really felt in communities. I have two young daughters, ages 7 and 9, Marin and Nora, hello, if you listen to this later. And I just got to the point where, you know, I think politics was taking up more of my time and thoughts, and I could either, you know, sit back and talk about it and hope that somebody would step up and maybe make the changes that I'd like to see, or I could actually act on it and do something. And I just didn't want to sit back any longer, just think about it. I wanted to actually try to make the change. Okay,
so cleaning up Congress is one of the lines that really stuck out to me on your website. It seems to be something that all of the candidates who are running for any congressional district across the entire country, for that matter, are interested in doing. But how does one person help contribute to that change? Obviously, it all starts with one person, but one person can't do it alone.
Yeah, I think it starts with one person, and not just that person, but I think the people around that person, the voters, you. I think us collectively making a decision on who we really want to be filling the offices and representing us. For myself, I didn't want to see just another politician step up and run or fill this seat. I think there's too many politicians out there, maybe individuals who always wanted to be politicians, and I guess that concerns me. I think when you're looking like too many are, just the upward mobility or the power or the influence, that's a very, I think, corruptive influence. And for me personally, you know, I could do it by just stepping up and running. And I think it really starts there. And to your point, yeah, you know, tough for me to, I think, be the change on my own. But I think this was also part of me not wanting to just run a traditional campaign. And I think that it's difficult to not, I think, run a traditional campaign. I mean, you're very much buried in the things that, you know, you need to see happen on behalf of a campaign. But I really wanted it to be about, I think, the movement that really brought me here. And I think that was a movement that was really working for the people. And that's really what I wanted to see continue. And so collectively, I think that we can make that change.
Now, you seem to have struck a chord with a lot of young people that I've talked to. They see you and they're like, this guy represents us. This guy is what we are. This is what we're thinking. How important is that young contingency of voters, ensuring that those people get out and actually are not just voting, but engaged like you, actually participating?
It's very important. And whether it's individuals who are maybe on the same side of the ideological fence or not, that's not my biggest concern. It's really, my concern is bringing more voices to the table and getting more people engaged. And, you know, I think the younger voters are a big chunk of that. But there's also a lot of people, probably the majority of people that do, that they're just disillusioned, I think, with the whole process, and they're not really engaged and somewhat checked out. And I think that to a certain extent, you know, it doesn't transcend age, but that is very important to me, and I'm really excited and thankful to have, I think, the support of some of the younger people that I encounter. And for me, running as a Democrat in the Democratic primary, I think that that's really important. You know, I think that there's not enough people who just typically vote Democrat out there to really make the change. But there are a lot of people, Democrats, Republicans, young, old, that really do want to see change. And so that's where the change, I think, can happen.
How realistic, obviously you're running, so you must feel it's pretty realistic. How much of a chance do you think a Democrat has if they don't move toward the middle in this district, which obviously does skew Republican? It seems to be something that a lot of the candidates are talking about sort of on the broad scale, but I'm wondering in actual application how you guys are thinking about tackling that, because someone is going to have to challenge Reed.
Yeah.
And that's going to be a challenge.
It is. I think the reality for me is that I never wanted to be a candidate who was going to, I think, willfully or intentionally try to be, I think, one person with a certain slant for the primary,
right,
and then begin shifting more center than when you get to the general. For myself, I'm tired of traditional politicians, I think, who do that, and I really wanted to be consistent in who I am and where I'm coming from. And I think there's a difference between playing that game and intentionally making those shifts and being sure that you're, I think, conscious in representing the district as a whole. So, for instance, if there are certain maybe areas of the district that I feel are a lot of voices that need to be heard, then I want to make sure that that's not necessarily, overpowering, maybe certain directions, that I may have gone. I'm here to represent the people, and that's really important to me. And in that, also to remain consistent. And I don't know that I've seen all, I think, candidates in our field really be consistent, and that's really important to me.
So let's talk about some of the issues. What are your sort of 2 or 3 big issues that you think are the most important right now, given the way things are?
Yeah, I think what's most important district-wide is just the living wage careers. I think that's been lost from a lot of communities. I think for me, and you started out with it there a question or two ago, talking about the corruption angle. I feel like if we really can't make the change to get the control of our government in check, from whether it be from big money donors or super PACs or whatever it is, I think the government process is very much corrupted. And I feel like if we can't take that back, and what does that look like? Those 2 financial pieces. Maybe it's talking about partisan gerrymandering and the way that the districts are really structured. Maybe it's how we're disenfranchising to a certain extent maybe minority populations or whole sects of people by making it difficult to vote in New York or the primaries. I think that there's a lot of pieces of that equation, but if we can't get that in check, then I think some of the other things that we really hope to accomplish become very difficult to do so. So I think that that's a very critical overarching issue. And I think that when you look at I think one of the last surveys that I looked at was maybe an approval rating of maybe 15% for Congress, right? And that's, I think the disturbing thing is that's not really an outlier, right? I mean, congressional approval ratings are almost perpetually 15 to like 22%. People are they're just not happy, I think, with the way that it is. And I think that corruption's a big piece of that. So that's one. But in terms of a day-to-day level, yeah, it's really putting, I think, food on the table. I mean, if you look at some of the measures of economic health, if you look at the record corporate profits for a lot of big corporations, if you look at up until recently the upward trajectory of the stock market, if you look at unemployment rates that have really come down, I think that it almost creates a false narrative than what's really playing out in the ground, particularly across our district and it's not just rural districts. I think there's some inner cities as well. And I think it's fairly detached from the reality. I think the reality is a lot of people are struggling. And if you look at the unemployment numbers, which may be talked about more recently, I think the reality is, at least for our district, that most of our counties are continually losing population year over year. There are people that are aging out of the workforce, other individuals who have just stopped looking for jobs, and even more that have maybe found jobs but are underemployed. Maybe they're part-time, maybe it's not a living wage. And so you look at something like the unemployment figure for even Ontario County, I think, which is one of the, lower ones. I don't know if it's necessarily representative of what people are really experiencing. So economy, I think, is big. It's whether people can put food on the table and pay their utility bills in the same month, whether they're able to save for their kids, let alone their own retirement. I think that's a really big deal in us figuring out how to stimulate pieces to improve that. So economy was 2. For me, it's healthcare. My first career, I was as an occupational therapist. So I worked in hospitals and home settings and rehab centers and with children with autistic spectrum disorders. And I think I really got to see firsthand that side of the healthcare equation. And when I decided to move into small business about 12 years ago, then I started seeing that part of the equation too, what it took to really buy in and provide health insurance for not only my own family, but managers and employees along the way. And, I'm seeing healthcare rates that have rising year over year, right? Higher deductibles, less care for what you're getting, and our outcome measures are no better. Healthcare is, I think, a really big issue. And then for number 3, which I've talked about a lot, has been public education. I had a really positive experience in a public education setting growing up. I'd really like to see more of a return to focus on vocational trades in addition to just college tracks, and really see what we can do to strengthen our local programs, whether it be BOCES or just vocational skills training in general. The more that I've also been out in the district, though, agriculture is, I think, becoming more and more I think at the forefront of my thinking. I think whether an actual job numbers or whether just the identity of our district, it's largely agriculture, and I think that there's a lot that can be done there.
Now, I'm really curious about what your perspective is on the small business side as it relates to the loss of manufacturing jobs in this district historically. It seems that no matter how many small businesses the region picks up, no matter how much success we hear about in the tourism sector and the Finger Lakes is thriving, there's a pretty large contingency of people, and I think it contributes to what you were just talking about a little bit with the economy in general. But no matter what, if it's not manufacturing, it isn't quite there. It isn't quite good enough. How do you read that, especially coming from the small business roots that you have?
Yeah, I think it's very real. You still look at some of the manufacturing jobs that we have left across the district, and a lot of them are the highest paying jobs in those counties. They're the jobs that maybe still have health and retirement benefits, and they're really critical pieces to our economy. And that's really important to me, right? There's only so many, I think, manufacturing sector jobs that we can lose and fill it in with what? I mean, you may be able to fill it in with retail stores like my own, right? But the reality is that being a small business owner in a retail store, like I can't match I think the salaries and the benefits that manufacturers can bring. And I think that the reality also here in District 23 is they really anchor still several of our local economies and counties, right? And that's really important. So for me, what does it take to strengthen that? Our current Representative Reed, I think, speaks a lot to manufacturing. He typically votes in favor of acts or bills that come across the table, but I still don't see much tangible impact in our district on what we're left with. I mean, we're still shedding those jobs. So what can we do to build them back up? I don't think it's necessarily an easy, I think, answer, right? Otherwise it would have been done by now. But I think that there are things that we can do. New York is one of the highest per capita union states in the country, right? And so if we're not speaking at a federal level to protecting our union workers and collective bargaining rights, it's going to be, I think, really difficult to keep the manufacturing jobs we have and what we know them to be. So I think that that's a big part of the equation.
Now, let's switch gears over to education. You mentioned that a couple minutes ago, and I'd like you to touch on that a little more, especially because we hear a lot rural districts are struggling more than any of the other districts in the state, especially the urban ones. Seems like at the state level there's a lot of energy and a lot of effort being put into making sure that the urban schools reach and continue to get better, but at the same time, some of the rural schools feel a little bit forgotten. How do you read that particular situation? Because it's a nuanced scenario where you have a lot of different moving parts. What do you think at the federal level can really be done to correct or help that sort of argument?
Yeah, and I was speaking with somebody on the phone, maybe it was in person at a recent campaign gathering, and they were reflecting on I think spending a year with vocational trades, and they were coming out of the city, and they had just mentioned they had one of the biggest BOCES or vocational training programs in the state, and it was coming out of the New York City. And I think what he was referencing was even agriculture. It wasn't just other vocational trades. It was really focused on ag. And so I don't know what the stats are like now on what those programs are versus rural, but I think that is a reality. I think that there's a lot of kids that are being missed. and not really connected with. And I realize a lot of that may be at the state or local level, the influence on education. But I think there are pieces of, can we still have voices at the federal level for those programs, right? Even if it's a small percentage of the funding equation, I think the voice is still really important, and it can still set a tone. And so there's one program that's a GST P-Tech BOCES Academy down by the Corning Elmira Airport. Mm-hmm. And we visited with them a couple times, and they're just 2 years into their program. And when kids come in, they mix grades, so it's not like you're just in a 9th grade classroom or now a 10th grade classroom. And they have really strategic alliances. The students come out with a 4-year high school degree, but also a 2-year degree from Corning Community College. And the way that the program is also set up is they have relationships with maybe 10 or 12 other manufacturers around them right there in the surrounding county or counties. And I think that those networks are really important. Mm-hmm. When I chatted with a friend who's the principal in the Ithaca City Schools, he had also just commented on feeling like, if there was one area of weakness, it was that, being able to, I think, reach some of those kids and also really cultivate those networks with other companies and manufacturers. And I think that that's a really critical piece of the equation, because you want that dialogue with those networks to say, these are the skills that we want students to have. Here's where we're at. Here's what we're looking at. And I think that, those pieces are, it almost takes somebody just championing the issue to really move it forward. And I think that can be done, I think somebody from the federal level.
Now, let's jump back into the healthcare side, but not directly, the opioid epidemic. Mm-hmm. Where do you think leaders should start, elected leaders should start? We've heard some really radical ideas. We've heard like safe injection sites, more treatment options, which seems like a very sensible approach to dealing mm-hmm. with the problem. But where do you think the best place would be to start? Obviously, everyone would like to see more treatment beds. That would be something that could probably help. But where do you personally feel like the best place to start is?
I think it could be addressing the supply to a certain extent. I think if the market being flooded with the very addictive opioids, paired with I think just the lack of education and awareness, or the mis-selling or misrepresenting of those drugs, I think was a critical piece to focus on. The lawsuit that's being filed right now against pharmaceutical companies, which I think has maybe 14 counties, I think at this point, on board with that lawsuit. That's I think one of those angles. You say the pharmaceutical companies did know about these medications. They did know the addictive properties, and despite that, they were still really pumping them out there, if not overflooding the market, maybe misrepresenting the addictive properties, and so they're maybe getting prescribed a lot more than they should have. I think that's one part, is that education and that supply. Both of those need to be, I think, addressed. Two, long-term, if we can work toward more long-term treatment options, rehab center in each one of the counties, that for sure needs to happen. Money in the budget for the research to come up with non-addictive alternatives. In this last budget gap measure that was just approved, there was some funding in there for NIH as well as the opioid specific funding, and that's a critical piece of the equation as well. And then I think we really do need to be thinking of if there are other ways out of the box that locales or communities want to try. I think it needs to be an all hands on deck. I think our current representative is more coming down on the punitive side of the equation, right? And you can arrest the network, but you really need to treat the user there. And I think in too many communities, there's not enough resources being placed on that side of the equation.
Mm-hmm. Now, question from one of our readers. They asked, what will you do, Ian, if you are elected to help protect our natural environment here in the Finger Lakes? Obviously, our natural resources pretty important to the Finger Lakes region. Mm-hmm. Where do you think that needs to start, or what do you think needs to be done better to make sure that things stay as great as they are right now? Yeah,
I think that equation is, has threads that tie through a lot of issues in terms of the dialogue that's there. I think on all of these topics, I think for various reasons, the discussions have become very divisive and just muddied. I think specifically with regard to the environment, when you talk about maybe environmental regulations or the EPA, I think it becomes a divisive wedge topic where I don't think it needs to be that way. I joined a couple friends at Interlake and Sportsman's Club probably late fall. Just an opportunity to go out there and just connect with people. And one of the friends that I connected with in conversation there, we were chatting a bit after we were shooting some skeet and clay that day. It was my first time ever doing that. But more just it was the genuine discussion and I think awareness that came with that. And one of the pieces that we talked about afterward, we did get onto, I think, just the, for instance, water quality. He and his brother and family grew up along Seneca Lake. They said they were big fishermen growing up and still are. But they said, where they used to fish, there's just no fish stocks left. And so they have to go over to Cayuga Lake to fish anymore. And for them, I think they're looking, or he was looking at potentially the agricultural runoff or the really uptick in the number of vineyards that are really in the watershed surrounding Seneca. And looking in that direction, and for him, it resonates on a local level. And as a sportsman, and as we talked, he got to the point where he'd support increased, I think, environmental regulation because it really applies to conservation of resources, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think that there's a lot of common ground that can be found in there as long as we can have those genuine discussions and see how people are being impacted. And so, when we talk about EPA strength and regulations, our current representative has across the board voted to gut clean air, water standards, not allow us to study the methane releases. These are all pieces that are really critical, and it doesn't need to be that way. I think if we look at some of the, just identity factors for us in this area, whether it's agriculture, whether it's a tourism economy, clean air, water makes a huge difference, right? And we need to protect those things and see it as conservation versus just regulation. So there would be some of the things that I could do at the federal level to, I think, strengthen some of those measures.
What do you say to the folks out there who are listening and saying, he's a Democrat, he just wants to take away our guns?
Yeah.
How does a Democrat who may fall more in the middle on a lot of the gun control issues in general combat that and connect with enough people to say, hey, wait a second, that's not necessarily my identity. Let's talk about it.
Yeah, and what you just said is the critical piece of the equation. Is let's talk about it. It's also one of those issues that it seems like we can't talk about anymore. For all of these mass shootings that are occurring all over the place, and they're just the ones that make the news, I don't think anybody knows how to talk about it anymore. And it's such a divided, polarized topic that we really need to be able to talk about it. I would guess that pretty much all legal gun owners in our district, nobody wants to see the mass shootings that are happening nationwide, at this point. But if we can't talk about it, we can't really address it. And so, I'm not here to just take away people's guns. What I am here to do is to be a representative and a community member who wants to have that dialogue. Let's get together, from the legal gun owners' perspectives. What do you want to see? What would help us cut down on the trauma that we're seeing across the country? And I'm also here to tell them that I'm also not here to craft legislation or weigh in on legislation that doesn't have their voices in the mix. I think when you talk at the state level with the SAFE Act or even up, I think if legislators continue to create and craft legislation that isn't drawn with a legal gun owner at the table and weighing in, then I feel like we're not going to get anywhere. It's just going to stay divided and dysfunctional and just a broken process.
How frustrating is that?
It is. It's frustrating, right? And it doesn't speak to just the issue of Second Amendment or guns. It's across the board. It's getting tougher and tougher. Those functional dialogues, and whether that's just the nature of how things have gone in dialogue, and whether it's driven by social media, whether it's driven by again the partisan gerrymandering of our districts, we've I think really lost the ability to genuinely connect.
So I want to ask, just as far as when you've been out, you've been talking to people, I'm assuming you've been knocking on some doors. What's been the biggest wow moment so far, the story that sort of sticks out in your mind as you mull through this really long process?
That's a a good question. I mean, I don't know if there's necessarily been a wow moment. I think people right now are so flooded with, I think, discontent about so much on the federal as well as even down, how that trickles down to the local level, that I think people are just generally frustrated, disillusioned, checked out, not feeling too positive, divisive in their dialogue. And I think that that's more that day-to-day just wait that I think doesn't allow me to have as many of those wow moments, because I think that that's the reality for most people and what I'm feeling on a day-to-day basis.
Now, why do you think you are the best candidate to take on Tom Reed this fall?
Yeah, for me, I feel like I've never really been one. It's not my strength to say this is what I think about myself. I think it's more I want to know what other people think. You know, if I can connect with people, if they feel like I'm the best candidate to take on Tom Reed, you know, then let's get there. Mm-hmm. I'm going to do what I can to, I think, have a strong voice and a strong campaign and create a movement in the mix. And, you know, hopefully we can get there. But I also feel like I'm one that has the capacity to potentially cross those, I think, party lines and genuinely connect with people. I'm not here because I rose up through a Democratic Party line. You know, I'm not here because I intend some long, powerful career in, you know, Congress. I'm not here because I want to be an absentee dad or father living down in D.C. You know, they're not the things that motivate me. What motivates me is trying to make genuine change and trying to reach people and trying to have those dialogues. And I think that they're really critical. And I don't know if all candidates in the mix are necessarily, I think, of that personality or will have the capacity to really just connect with people. And through the, I think, just, you know, I think I'm pretty genuine in where I'm coming from, and I hope to convey that to people. That's really what's who I am.
Now, last question before we get you out of here. How important do you think, in your estimation, the united front is? After the primary, that Democrats really all get behind a single candidate and push for this, because it really, when you talk about the end of June, you're into July, August, September, and that's a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
To beat an incumbent with the kind of advantage that he has. So how important is that massing that has to happen?
It is important. I think it's very important for us all to come together and really work toward a common goal of presenting new and positive change, right? And I think a united front, I think, needs to extend beyond the Democratic Party. We've got, I think 15 donors into our campaign that are Republicans. We've got a bunch of independents, right? I think we really need to get collectively to the point where this isn't really about right or left, Republican versus Democrat. It really needs to be a united front of those who the system's really been working against to move forward. And I think that that's really our collective identity here in District 23 in rural New York. I think a reality is that a lot of us and a lot of our communities have been left behind, and there's the united front.
Mm-hmm. And last question, of course, where can people connect with you? Where can they find you?
Yeah, they can find me at Ian, I-A-N, at goldenforcongress.com is my email address. Cell phone number 607-216-8755. You can connect with me there. Website is goldenforcongress.com. And it would be wonderful to really connect with people one-on-one through just genuine dialogue. So tune in for our updates, join a meet and greet, host a house party, plug in with volunteering, whether it be just getting word out. We start the petition process coming up. We can for sure use more hands. Any and all of those would be great ways to reach out.
All right. Well, I really appreciate you coming in today, and best of luck moving forward.
Yeah, thanks so much, Josh.
That's going to do it for us today. I'd like to thank Ian, our listeners, and of course, FingerLakes1.com for making this podcast possible. Inside the FLX airs Sundays at 7 p.m. on Spectrum, channel 1304, and is available on iTunes, Stitcher, and the FingerLakes1.com app. Thanks for listening, and we will catch you next time.